Hi, this is Jennifer Corey with the Heart Initiative, and you are you're joining us for our next session of Living with Heart. And today I have the pleasure of introducing you to Emily Esfahani Smith. Emily is a writer. She lives in Washington, D.C. She's a writer. In fact, she is the author of this amazing book right here, which we're going to have a link to at the end of this interview, called The Power of Meaning: Crafting a Life That Matters. Emily has also written for the New York Times, the Atlantic, the Wall Street Journal. She has a TED Talk that's been viewed over 8 million times, and her articles have reached people. She has 2 articles in the New York Times or the Atlantic, that have reached people more than 30 million people. Emily's area of writing and expertise is in philosophy, psychology, and really what it means to be human and how we can derive meaning in this experience of our human existence, even in the midst of suffering. And so I could not think of anybody who would be better for us to be speaking with at this point in time and hearing from than Emily about how to navigate an experience like COVID-19 from a perspective of meaning. So welcome, Emily. I'm so glad to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Jennifer.
Thank you for agreeing to do this. So let's just begin with a definition of meaning.
So meaning, in my book and my writing, kind of drew on the psychology research and also philosophy, and the definitions in both fields kind of converged. And so I defined it in my book as connecting and contributing to something beyond yourself. And that could be a lot of different things. It could be your community, it could be your family, it could be your sense of God or the divine or something like that. And that's kind of, a generic definition. But then when you look at people who rate their lives as meaningful, there are these kind of 3 criteria that psychologists pick up on. One is they believe their lives are significant. The second is they believe their lives are driven by a sense of purpose. And then finally, they believe their lives make sense. So there's coherence there.
So will you say a little bit about the difference between meaning and happiness?
Yeah, so I kind of began writing about meaning really when I was a student in math, which is the program that we both did, a master's in positive psychology. And during one of our sessions, a professor who was a psychology researcher came and told us about a new study that she had been involved with, differentiating a meaningful life from a happy life. And I thought it was really provocative because I'd never really thought about meaning and happiness separately. I thought, I thought like, oh yeah, like everyone wants to be happy. And if you pressed me, I would have probably said that meaning is part of that or something. But it turns out that they're 2 different paths. It's true that you can both have meaning and happiness, but it's also true that you can have one and not the other. And so, happiness, the way psychologists define it and measure it, it's a positive mental and emotional state. So if you feel good, you're happy. If you feel bad, you're unhappy. And it's momentary. So it's kind of a feeling that comes and goes. And meaning, as I said, it's really about kind of connecting to something beyond yourself. And you can think about how I was just reading through a book called The Upside of Stress by Kelly McGonigal, and she talks about a study where I think it was by Gallup, where they showed that the most stressful, the countries where rates of stress were the highest were also the countries where rates of well-being are the highest. And I think it makes sense because a lot of times the things that bring our lives meaning don't make us happy in the moment, like raising kids or working in general, or working on some project. And yet those are the things that make our lives meaningful, even though they're stressful and require effort and things like that.
I think what an important distinction to make now of all times, that we can be deriving meaning or experiencing something that's going to be very meaningful to our lives in the absence of happiness in the moment. I'm not sure that people would define this period of time in their lives as a happy period. It's a really stressful and difficult period. So to hear that research from the Gallup organization that you read in Kelly McGonigal's book, I think is very hopeful, isn't it? That through our struggles or through our suffering, we can be in the midst of something that is really building a sense of meaning in our own lives.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that was why that research really resonated with me, because it kind of validated the experiences of so many people who are in some ways, like their lives are, you know, a microcosm of what we're all experiencing now. Like they might be struggling or suffering in one way or another. And in our culture, like there's so much emphasis on happiness. And so a life that is hard doesn't feel as valued. And yet I think like meaning helps us understand why those lives are valuable too, and why some of our most difficult experiences, even if they're not making us happy, those are really the places where we find meaning. And I'm kind of, you know, looking back through some of my old notes from my book and stuff, and I came across something that talked about how, and I think it was from research, where people who've had like one really bad experience rate their lives as more meaningful than people who've had no bad experiences. People who have had two really bad experiences rate their lives as more meaningful than people who have one. And so like there's something about these difficult experiences, while we wouldn't wish them on anyone, they are kind of builders of meaning.
So are there specific conditions that help us move from something that is just difficult and struggling and trying to something that is meaningful? Because, you know, we have something called the ACEs score, adverse childhood events. Or we look at things that are identified as traumatic. I really like that Richard Tradishi changed it to potentially traumatic events, PTEs, so that we're not automatically assigning. But I think it's important to note, are there certain conditions or elements that convert something from just being difficult, being mired in the struggle of it, to being meaningful?
Yeah, so you know, when Tedeschi and his colleague Calhoun, you know, as you know, like they came up with this idea of post-traumatic growth, and so you know, we hear a lot about post-traumatic stress disorder, but it turns out that more people actually grow through adversity than get kind of bowled over by it, even though the media focuses so much on post-traumatic stress. And, you know, Tedeschi and Calhoun found that people grow in 5 different ways. For example, their relationships deepen, their spiritual lives deepen, they develop a deeper sense of spirituality and purpose. And when they looked at what was going on, like why did some people grow and others not, what they found is that the people who grew engaged in what they called deliberative rumination, which is basically, I think, kind of a fancy way of talking about like sense making, like creating a narrative out of what happened through which they find positive meaning. So they're able to like take the event and reflect on it deeply enough and tell a story about it that wasn't just like, this event was horrible and ruined my life, but this event was horrible, and at the same time, like it helped me grow in these ways or change my life in these positive ways.
So that idea of deliberate rumination makes me think of the way that we might be able to use literature or history or philosophy or religion right now, or really throughout the course of our human existence, as a way of understanding the relationship between struggle and meaning. Would you say a little bit about how those historical pieces can influence the way that we think about what's happening? You know, it's always interesting when we look at it reflectively or retrospectively, but is there a way to be able to grow or build from that in the moment?
Definitely. I mean, I was reading through some studies just, I guess, yesterday about kind of resilience and adversity. And the studies talked about how some people found comfort during really difficult times by reading stories. And, you know, whether they were stories from the Bible or stories from literature, the one that came to mind, that I think it was the parent of a child who was diagnosed with some kind of terminal illness. And the parent, you know, obviously this is really, really difficult and traumatic. And the parent was reading the book of Job, which is about kind of, you know, suffering, senseless suffering. And that kind of brought the parent comfort. And I think, you know, more generally, these experiences, well, when you read, you know, you're kind of like processing your own story through the story of what you're reading. And it kind of gives you some distance from what you're going through, which is good, because the research shows that helps people actually make better engage in the sense-making process once they're a little bit removed from the pain of what's happening. So you kind of have this distance at the same time, like as that narrative of whatever you're reading or seeing or hearing unfolds, you're kind of like able to like use it to like make sense of your own experiences. I think that, I mean, that's one way. And the other way, I think, is just by showing that, you know, you're not alone in your suffering, that like, you know, this is like just part of the human condition. You know, in scriptures that are thousands of years old and novels that are hundreds of years old, like these themes like come up again and again. And so I think that feeling of like not being alone in the world is also really helpful for people as they cope.
And there are reasons that those stories are so enduring in our culture.
Yeah.
It's because they're relatable throughout all of history, right? It's one of the things that connects us to everything that came before and everything that will come after, this idea that suffering is a part of our existence.
Yeah, exactly.
You wrote about, and I thought brilliantly, about that paradox between, and your book was published in 2017, in the paradox that existed between the stability and the security and the opportunities that existed that exist in life at this particular point in time, and yet these very high levels of depression and despair. In fact, these sort of ever-growing levels of depression and despair. It made me wonder, as I was sitting just reading and taking comfort in your book this weekend, about the opportunities for growth that happen in the midst of the struggle that you're dealing with. And I wondered if you've had time to reflect in the last couple of weeks about the opportunities for meaning that might be present for all of us as we're going through the uncertainty of this time.
Yeah, it's such a great question. And I have been thinking about it. It's part of what sent me back, like looking through these different studies and notes and stuff that I was talking about earlier. And I think that there are a few ways that like we can kind of find meaning in the midst of this. And I think that some of the ways are, you know, we're already seeing unfold, and they've kind of been written about, you know, coming together as community to help, you know, elderly people or the more vulnerable. I know, like in my apartment complex here in DC, there's, you know, some people put together a help group. We have a lot of like older people who live here. And so a help group to like help them run errands or pick up prescriptions or go to the grocery store for them. So these kind of ways to kind of cultivate connection and build purpose among the people who are helping. I think that's one way to make meaning, finding ways to be useful and helpful during the crisis. And there are other ways too. I think that, you know, just in your own mind, like how you think about what's happening is a way to build meaning. Like meaning does come from the things you do, but it also comes from how you perceive of your circumstances. And so for one person, what's happening right now is really scary and threatening. Whereas for another, it's like a challenge to overcome. And so if you kind of have this kind of positive reframing on it and finding like a positive meaning, that's another way to kind of, you know, cope with what's happening a little bit better and find that meaning.
Yeah, so that idea of crafting your own narrative around it. And I want to make sure that we distinguish for people that what we're not talking about is a denial of what is. I mean, these are the circumstances. In fact, the work that I've done and the research that I've looked at around resilience is one of the key elements that the most resilient people have is this capacity to identify and accept the circumstances as they are. They spend time fighting and resisting it, which frees up more energy for navigating the circumstances. So that writing of the narrative is not intended to be a denial in any way. It's an acceptance of these are the circumstances. I did an interview with somebody you and I both know, Corey Muscara, and he talks about moving from the what if thought process to the what is. Okay, what is right here, right now? But then being able to craft your narrative around, so these are the circumstances. What are the various ways of being able to be with this and to sit with this? One is to see this as just this, you know, terrible crisis and maybe some kind of tragedy or something that never should have happened, or but maybe that's not the only way to sit with it.
Yeah, no, thank you for making that point, because it is such a good one, that when you're talking about narrative, it's really important to not like whitewash the hard parts of it. And some of the research that you mentioned reminded me of other research on resilience that shows that the people who are the most resilient are really good at letting like positive emotions and thoughts coexist with like negative emotions and thoughts in them. And so like they're not kind of denying that the hardness of it, but they're able to kind of call on other resources to help them get through it.
In psychology, it's referred to as the dialectic meaning, that we recognize this is an incredibly difficult or very uncertain time, and there are acts of great kindness happening. So that capacity to be able to really sit in the presence and have a deep acceptance for both. So what were you calling it? Deliberate rumination, right? That's Calhoun and Tahishi's wording around it. But that ability, it's like a real active perspective taking, so that we don't go all the way into a dark place. So in light of that, would you mind sharing with us one of your best practices as you're navigating this time?
So I've kind of on and off had meditate basically, and it's mostly been kind of a standard mindfulness meditation, but I have been doing more loving kindness meditation, and I think because of like the virus spreading now, when I go out on the street and I see people, I kind of see them in a different way. It's like, oh, like this, like people seem more vulnerable. And so, but that like creates kind of like more of an open-hearted perspective. And so I think about that a lot, like when I'm meditating, and how all of us, like everyone is kind of suffering in their own way through this. And I find that that's just helped me be a little bit more like compassionate and empathetic towards what people are going through in general, and to kind of tune into it as well in a way that feels more productive than like checking the news every 10 minutes, which is what I was doing, last week around this time.
So one of the things that I'm recommending from a mental health perspective is that people put boundaries around their media exposure. So maybe 10 minutes in the morning, 10 minutes at night, and I've promised people that they will have more than enough information to go on in order to make really good and reasonable decisions. But at the same time, it's very self-preserving. So it's an act of real self-love to create those boundaries. And I think part of what it does is, if we don't allow fear to fill up the entire space, then we have room for other things like loving kindness. And when you said that, you made me think right away of Kristin Neff's work around self-compassion. And I was thinking of that part where, you hold your hands over your own heart and you say, you acknowledge this is a moment of suffering. And then the piece that made me think of it was when you said, I went out on the street and suddenly I saw the vulnerability of everybody. Because the second part of Kristin Neff's work is all human beings suffer, meaning that we experience this moment of suffering, this time of suffering, as a great unifier. Right? This is part of what connects us as humanity. And then the third piece of her work is, may I have what I need to navigate this time of suffering, or to be reassured in this time, or to feel hopeful in this time of suffering. And you can add the other element of it, which is, may all people have what they need. And in a way, isn't that almost like a little mini loving kindness piece?
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that. I know who she is, but I'm not super familiar with like her work beyond, that she studies self-compassion, but that's really beautiful, and I'll definitely check it out because that sounds great.
Yeah, so it's the self-compassion work by Kristin Neff. And the same way I think Jon Kabat-Zinn brought meditation and mindfulness through MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction, into the West in a way that had this kind of practicality to it, and sort of maybe took it out of what felt more like a spiritual or a very philosophical perspective. This is what I think Kristin Neff has done in a way for loving kindness meditation, which is
that's great.
Done all this research and sort of condensed this way in which we can use this loving kindness practice, which I have found enormously helpful. And I was very reluctant to do it in the beginning because it felt kind of like, oh, come on, sort of like, remember the thing from the 80s, I'm good enough and gosh darn it, like feel a little too affirmation-y. But the truth is that there's a lot of research behind it. And it's an incredibly grounding, I would call it a very anchoring kind of practice or process.
Totally.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Oh, I just one last point, like around the research around it. The research is so fascinating. I mean, it shows that it makes you kind of more, connected to others and stuff. But I also saw a study just the other day that it actually is like associated with increased longevity, because it helps protect against the deterioration of like your telomere ends. And so there's like real like powerful science behind it.
Wow, so this is the loving kindness meditation, the Metta Bhavana practice.
Yeah, so yeah, and I think in that study, they were specifically distinguishing it from more traditional mindfulness practice. So there's something about loving kindness that goes kind of above and beyond.
Yeah, actually, okay, we're going to go down into a spiral, but I will just say briefly that the work of Richard Davidson around contemplative neuroscience, for anybody who wants to sort of do a little bit of research around that, has shown us that master meditators, those with 10,000 hours or more, that their brains respond very different to pain, suffering, and crises than the rest of us do. Not that they don't get activated, but they don't have all of the pre-activation. And so there's much more of sort of this balanced response system. Then they have the activation to the moment of suffering, like if they have something painful happen, right? But their return to baseline is much, much faster. Where people who don't have not practiced meditation, it's much more like it takes much longer, and it sort of jumps around as it's going out. And it takes a long time to get back to that baseline. But the interesting thing around that work was then finding that people who just practiced an hour of meditation a day, or maybe it was a half hour a day for 8 weeks, also showed a profound change in how they reacted or responded to crises or struggle or pain or suffering.
Wow.
So what I mean to say by that is you can start wherever you are in this moment, right here, right now. And I think because maybe it moves us out of that place of reacting into more a place of responding. Do you think, Emily, it gives us more of an opportunity to make meaning if we have more of that space and that measured response?
I think so, because I think part of what's happening when you're responding instead of reacting is you're taking like a bigger frame on the situation. So instead of having that like narrow view of like, oh gosh, like something bad's happening and like I'm gonna respond, you're able to see like the fuller picture. And when you see the fuller picture, human beings have like a really strong negativity bias, so are more likely to like see the negative, remember the negative. And so what that means is we discount like the good, the meaning, the positive things that can help us get through this. And when we take that broader perspective, I think we can see more clearly like what reality is, and then use that to kind of move forward.
Would you say, is there a particular app or guided loving kindness meditation, or do you just use the script itself? I'd like for people who aren't experienced with it to hear what some of the options are for ways of being able to practice that.
Definitely. So the two kind of teachers that and I do the guided meditations. The two teachers that I would recommend are Tara Brach, T-A-R-A Brach, B-R-A-C-H, and her meditations are available online and on like Spotify and probably other ways that, like iTunes, I'm sure. And they're free. And she does have some loving kindness ones. Most of them are kind of traditional mindfulness, but if you scroll through, you'll find loving kindness ones. And then Jack Kornfield is another one who I really like. And I have on Audible, I bought like, a 2-hour, like it's not like a book, but it's kind of like a series of guided meditations that he does. It wasn't that expensive, but one of them, and they're all really good, but one of them is like a 25-minute loving kindness one. And I think I haven't done any of hers, but I know Sharon Salzberg is like, big in the loving kindness meditation world.
Yeah. So you just named 3 of the biggest teachers we have here in the West. So that's wonderful. I'll add to that people could sign up for Calm or Insight Timer. Calm is offering a free month, and Insight Timer is always free unless you move into the paid subscription. But I mean to say that just to say that both of them also offer loving kindness meditations. And so those are ways of doing it. And we can always find the script online as well. My next question, I just have 2 left, and that is, given the circumstance as they presently exist, exactly as they are right here, right now, what are you hoping for?
What am I hoping for? I'm hoping that that things go back to normal with as few people harmed and sick as possible. I think that's kind of my primary hope. And then more specific within that, and this kind of feels a little bit selfish, but that like everyone I know and love, like especially kind of gets through this time without any harm coming to them.
Understandably. And I think we can all relate to that feeling for sure. And last but not least is, what are you the most grateful for today?
I'm really grateful for my husband. We're both kind of working from home right now, and I've been thinking a lot about what this would be like if I were single, if I were by myself, and I think it'd be a lot harder. And so having someone who I love and loves me, and that we get to kind of, one silver lining, one positive meaning that I've been able to find is that even though our routines have been completely upended, we're getting to spend this time together that we wouldn't have been able to otherwise. And we get to work, but then we can actually like have lunch together, go for like walks together instead of taking like a 10-minute break by ourselves to check Facebook or something. So there's been kind of some sweetness there that I've been really grateful for.
What my mother would have referred to as savoring the simple pleasures.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's one of the things that this experience has taught me too, is just like simplicity and how before, I thought that I needed so many things and to go to so many places. And now all the places I go to are shut down, and, I don't need them. And you realize that you don't need them and you can get by on a lot less.
Thank you so much for your time, Emily. I really appreciate it tremendously. I think your wisdom adds to this voice that we're trying to put out into the world right now to help people gain a different perspective, gain a sense of calm, and in the case of our discussion, be able to step back and consider the narrative, the story that we're telling ourselves about what happens and how important that is, and the meaning behind it and the influence that will have over our life. I was telling Emily this before we got started, that I settled in this weekend with her book. My intention was to just reread the first couple of chapters of it so that my memory would be fresh for this interview. And then I couldn't put it down. I sat 4 hours in the sun on Saturday reading it, and I will just continue to read it. So I really recommend this. I recommend that you listen to her TED Talk, that you look for her book on Amazon and other places that it is sold, and that you allow these words to wash over you and bring you comfort and hopefully help you to craft some deliberate, intentional meaning in your own life at this challenging time. Emily, thank you for your time. I really appreciate it tremendously. It's wonderful to see you as always.
Yeah, thank you. This has been really great, Jennifer, and thank you. I mean, I've learned so much just in this, 20 minutes from your wisdom, and there are things I was writing down that I want to follow up on that you said. So it's really been wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you.